Hello students. Today we are going to discuss about brain and spinal cord, which are components of a very important organ system in our body. One of the control and coordinating systems in our body, that is the nervous system. Human brain is located within the cranial cavity of the skull, and it weighs about 1350 grams to 1400 grams, and it utilizes 25% of the total oxygen that our body takes in. It is protected externally by the cranium, by the meninges, and by the cerebrospinal fluid. The meninges are membranous coverings protecting the brain. They are the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater from outside to inside. In between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater, there is a space which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid that basically acts as a shock absorber. Now, when we study brain, we study it under three headings: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain consists of the cerebrum, the olfactory lobes, and the diencephalon. The midbrain consists of the optic lobe and the cerebral peduncles. And the hindbrain consists of the cerebellum, pons varolii, and medulla oblongata. We are going to confine our discussion to three important parts of the brain, which are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Now, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. As you can see on this slide, it is the largest part of the brain. The outer surface of the cerebrum is highly convoluted, and it is made up of ridges and grooves. The ridges are technically called gyri and the grooves are technically called sulci. The purpose of these convolutions is to increase the surface area of the cerebrum so as to accommodate more number of neurons. The cerebrum is made up of two cerebral hemispheres, which are joined ventrally by a transverse sheet of nerve fibers called corpus callosum. The function of corpus callosum is to transmit the nerve impulses from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. The cerebrum is the seat of intelligence. It is the seat of memory, speech, learning, and it is responsible for all the higher faculties which a person manifests. So, as you can see on this slide, cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and it is made up of two cerebral hemispheres. Corpus callosum is a transverse sheet of nerve fibers which connects the two cerebral hemispheres ventrally. And the outer surface of the cerebrum is highly convoluted and is made up of gyri and sulci. The cerebrum is divided into two regions, the outer cerebral cortex and the inner cerebral medulla. The cerebral cortex is also called the grey matter and the cerebral medulla the white matter. The grey matter is made up of the cell bodies of the neurons and the white matter is made up of myelinated axons. In fact, this arrangement exists in all the parts of the brain excepting the medulla oblongata where it gets reversed. The grey matter in the brain lies on the outer part and the white matter in the central part Or in other words, the grey matter is located in the peripheral part and the white matter on the inside or at the central part. Now, each cerebral hemisphere is made up of 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And as you can see, the functions are all depicted over here. You can understand they are responsible for so many important functions taking place in the body. Like the frontal lobe is associated with memory, reasoning, judgment, the parietal lobe with movement, orientation, posture and recognition, the temporal lobe with hearing, and the occipital lobe for sight. Now before we move on to hindbrain, I must tell you that midbrain is a small tubular part which connects the forebrain with the hindbrain. Now the hindbrain consists of the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, and it is also referred to as the lesser brain. It's located below the cerebrum, and it is made up of 2 cerebellar hemispheres and a middle vermis. Convolutions are absent, which means gyri and sulci are absent. This is a major point of difference between cerebrum and cerebellum. In cerebrum, convolutions in the form of gyri and sulci are present, but in the cerebellum, convolutions are absent. Instead, deep furrows are present. These are the important functions of the cerebellum. First one, it controls body equilibrium and body balance. It also controls muscular coordination and it controls posture. Let me cite a give reason question over here. A drunkard walks clumsily, or an alcoholic walks clumsily. What is the reason behind this? This is because it has been studied that alcohol impacts the cerebellum. And cerebellum, as you can see, it controls body balance, muscular coordination, and posture. So when alcohol impacts cerebellum, obviously these functions are all hampered. They get affected. So that is why the person is not able to maintain his body balance or his posture or his muscular coordination. Now the medulla oblongata is also a part of the hindbrain. It's located at the base of the skull and it forms the lowermost part of the brain stem. Which is the brain stem? The midbrain, the pons varolii and the medulla oblongata. Since they are lying in a straight line, this is referred to as the brain stem. So medulla is a part of the brain stem. In fact, this is the lowermost part of the brain stem. In case of medulla oblongata, the arrangement of grey matter and white matter is reversed. That means the grey matter is at the center and the white matter occurs at the periphery. I had told you earlier that in brain, excepting medulla oblongata, the grey matter lies outside or in the peripheral part and the white matter lies inside. But in medulla oblongata, the grey matter is at the center and the white matter is located at the periphery. These are 2 very important functions of the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata controls involuntary activities like breathing, heartbeat, circulation, peristalsis, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So from this you can imagine how very important this part is for our very existence, for our very survival. It has been found out that injury to the medulla oblongata results in instant death. Here this can be asked in the form of a reasoning question. Injury to the medulla oblongata result in instantaneous death. Why? The reason is the moment the medulla oblongata gets injured, activities like breathing, heartbeat, peristalsis, these are all involuntary activities. These activities, they stop instantly. So, it results in a sudden death. Besides this, it also controls reflexes like coughing, sneezing, vomiting, hiccuping, yawning, etc. These are the other functions of medulla oblongata. Now, the next component of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long, cylindrical, tubular structure arising from the medulla oblongata. It arises from the medulla oblongata, passes through a large opening present at the back of the skull or at the back of the cranium called foramen magnum. Then it runs down the neural canal of the vertebral column. Neural canal is a central opening in each vertebra making up our vertebral column or the backbone, and it continues up to the lower end of the first lumbar vertebra. So this gives you the precise location of the spinal cord. It emerges from the medulla oblongata, passes through the foramen magnum located at the back of the skull, and it runs down through the neural canal of the vertebral column and extends up to the lower end of the first lumbar vertebra. Like the brain is protected by the cranium, the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid, the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid. In the spinal cord, the grey matter occupies the central part and the white matter the peripheral part. The arrangement is just reversed. As in brain, the grey matter occupies the peripheral part and the central part is occupied by the white matter. In spinal cord, it is just the opposite. The grey matter forms the central part and the white matter the peripheral part. Now, the spinal cord is divided into 31 segments, and from each segment, a pair of spinal nerves arises. And all the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. It means it is made up of both sensory neurons as well as motor neurons. So, since from each segment a pair of spinal nerves arises, so there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And depending on the region in which they are present, the spinal nerves are classified into cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, sacral spinal nerves and coccygeal spinal nerves, which are 8 pairs, 12 pairs, 5 pairs and again 5 pairs and finally 1 pair respectively. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves and all the spinal nerves are mixed nerves, which means they are made up of both sensory neuron as well as motor neuron. Functions of spinal cord. The most important function of spinal cord is it controls all reflexes below the neck. Now, what is a reflex or what is a reflex action? It is a sudden, automatic, involuntary, instantaneous response to a stimulus, generally without the involvement of the brain. So, it is an involuntary response, generally without the involvement of the brain. So, that is a reflex action, and almost all reflexes below the neck are controlled by the spinal cord. Besides that, it also conducts sensory impulses from periphery to the brain. Sensory impulses are those impulses which travel from the receptor to the CNS. And spinal cord also conducts motor impulses from the brain to the periphery. Motor impulses are those impulses which are carried from the CNS to the effector. So these are the three important functions of the spinal cord. This figure will give you a clear picture of the section of the spinal cord. This figure represents the cross section of a segment of the spinal cord. The first thing that you notice over here is the arrangement of grey matter and white matter. The grey matter is located centrally and the white matter is located peripherally. At the center of the grey matter, there is an opening present which is called the central canal. Now the central canal of the spinal cord is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So as any fluid in the body does its function in a similar manner, the cerebrospinal fluid, it is basically a shock absorber. And besides the arrangement of grey matter and white matter, you can also observe that from each segment arises a pair of spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves are all mixed nerves. Why did you say mixed nerves? Because it is made up of both sensory neuron as well as motor neuron. The sensory neuron carries impulses from the receptor to the spinal cord and the motor neuron carries impulses from the spinal cord to the effector. Though in this diagram we don't see the receptor and the effector, but we know that these impulses which are carried by the sensory neuron are brought from the receptor to the spinal cord and the motor neuron carries the impulses from the spinal cord to the effector, which might be a muscle or a gland. So what did you learn today? Basically, you learned the parts of the human brain and their location and function. Besides that, you also learned about spinal cord and the arrangement of grey matter and white matter in the brain as well as in the spinal cord and the cross-sectional view of the spinal cord. So next class, we are going to study about reflex action and the peripheral nervous system. Thank you, children.